a man hardened by loss. You've experienced immense loss in your life, your wife, your daughter.
Pierce Brosnan was never the most dangerous man in the room because of the gun. The danger lived in the smile, specifically the kind that reached his eyes and suggested the person behind it had seen enough of the world to understand exactly what it cost, and had decided, against all available evidence, to remain fond of it anyway. That is not charisma. That is survival wearing charisma as its best coat. The story of how a boy from the wet, quiet edges of rural Ireland became the most iconic spy in cinema history while privately enduring losses that would have hollowed out most people entirely is not a story about fame. It is a story about what a person is made of when everything they love gets taken from them, and they have to decide again and again whether the world still deserves their presence in it. Drogheda, County Louth, Ireland, on May 16, 1953, is where Pierce Brendan Brosnan came into the world, and the losses started almost immediately. His father, Thomas Brosnan, left before Pierce was old enough to retain a single memory of him. No argument, no dramatic departure, just absence settling into the house like weather. His mother, May Smith, was young and facing a future with no structural support, so she traveled to London to train as a nurse and left her toddler son in the care of his maternal grandparents in Navan, County Meath. Pierce was barely 1 year old. Before he could string a sentence together, his family had already become a series of empty chairs, and the question that has no words but lives in the body like a low constant ache had already taken root. Why wasn't I enough to make her stay? When his grandparents died, Pierce moved to an aunt, then to a family friend, each arrangement delivering the same quiet message that he was temporary, a guest in other people's permanence. He was not abused or starved. He was simply passed along, a boy without a fixed address in the deepest sense, the sense that has nothing to do with geography and everything to do with whether anyone has truly claimed you as theirs. Art became shelter in those years, drawing and painting the way children do when the interior world feels safer than the exterior one. At 10 years old, his mother reappeared. She had built her nursing career in London, remarried, and sent for him, and so Pierce packed what little he had and traveled to a city that spoke his language but felt entirely foreign, to live with a woman who was legally his mother and emotionally a stranger. He would later describe those years with a restraint that speaks louder than any elaboration, saying he was always the outsider, always looking in. That sentence contains an entire childhood. London in the late 1960s had no interest in a quiet, displaced Irish teenager with second-hand clothes and the particular guardedness of someone who had spent his whole life learning not to need too much from anyone. None of that changed until he stumbled into a part-time job with a traveling circus at 17 and learned to eat fire. Something happened performing for strangers in those cold London streets that no classroom had ever produced in him. People actually looked at him. For a boy who had spent his entire childhood feeling like a temporary arrangement, commanding a crowd's attention was not entertainment. It was a revelation about what he might be capable of. At 18, he found his way to the Drama Centre London, one of the most demanding acting schools in the country, arriving with no formal training and no connections, and whatever unquantifiable quality great teachers spend careers learning to recognize, the faculty recognized it in him. The school's method demanded that students excavate themselves, that genuine performance requires reaching into your own unresolved history and bringing it somewhere an audience can feel it. For most students, that was confronting. For Pierce, it was almost too natural, because he had an entire childhood of material: the absent father, the mother who left, the years of being passed along, the silence he had learned to carry like a second skin. The very things that had made him feel broken became the tools of his craft. Graduating in 1975, he built himself slowly through theater productions that paid very little and demanded everything, and then in 1982 came Remington Steele, an American television series requiring him to play a charming, witty character with a confidence that felt entirely unconstructed because it largely was. America noticed, and with America's attention came the first whisper of the name that would follow him for the rest of his life. None of that mattered as much as what he found at a London party in 1977, which was Cassandra Harris, an Australian-born actress of striking beauty and fierce intelligence whose presence filled rooms through genuine warmth rather than volume. She was married at the time. The connection was immediate and inconvenient and entirely indifferent to timing. They became friends first, and then after her marriage ended, they married in 1980, with Pierce adopting her 2 children, Charlotte and Christopher, without condition or hesitation. For a man who had grown up without a father, without the certainty of being chosen, choosing those children was not generosity. It was a declaration of everything he had decided to become. For the first time in his adult life, Pierce had a home. Not an address, but a home. The kind measured in laughter over breakfast, and the specific safety of knowing the people behind the door are genuinely glad you exist. Cassandra gave him roots when his entire life had been defined by uprootedness, and then in 1987, with their son Sean not yet born, she received a diagnosis of ovarian cancer. Pierce stepped back from the momentum of a career clearly heading somewhere and placed Cassandra at the center of his world with a completeness those who witnessed it never forgot, driving her to treatments, sitting beside her through the long, unglamorous hours that have no script, holding the family together with a quiet determination that carried nothing performative in it. He would say later that you learn very quickly what matters and what doesn't, and the rest falls away. Meanwhile, the role that had been building toward him arrived and was immediately taken back. In 1986, Eon Productions officially offered him the role of James Bond for The Living Daylights, and he accepted. Then NBC, the network behind Remington Steele, exercised a contractual clause and renewed the show abruptly, almost certainly because the Bond announcement had restored its commercial value overnight. Pierce was legally bound, Eon could not wait, Timothy Dalton was cast, and Pierce watched from the sidelines as the role he had already accepted was handed to someone else, not because anyone thought he was wrong for it, but because a network had done its arithmetic. He handled it publicly with grace, though privately the wound was real, not merely a missed opportunity, but the culmination of everything he had been building since the fire-eating act in the London cold delivered back to him unopened. He kept making films, remained present for his family, and waited with the specific patience of a man who had learned from childhood that the things worth having rarely arrive on schedule. For 4 years, Cassandra fought with humor and sharpness, and an absolute refusal to be defined by what was consuming her body. And on December 28, 1991, she died at 43 years old. Pierce was 38, with 3 children, and a grief so total that those who knew him describe a man who had gone somewhere inside himself that was very difficult to reach. Working became the only architecture left standing because 3 children needed a father who showed up, and those who watched him on set in the years following her death saw something in his performances that no acting school teaches because it cannot be taught: a weight behind the eyes, a quality of loss that can only be lived. In 1994, Eon Productions called again. Timothy Dalton had stepped away, Pierce was 41, and still carrying the full weight of everything the previous years had taken from him, and he said yes. GoldenEye opened in November 1995, and the verdict was immediate and absolute. Pierce Brosnan was James Bond, not tentatively, not provisionally, but with an inevitability that silenced any remaining debate. Beyond the physicality and the wit, lived something none of his predecessors had brought to the role in quite the same way. A sadness behind the eyes that the script never explained but that audiences felt in every scene because it was not performed. Bond is a character defined by loss, by emotional distance maintained as a matter of survival, and Pierce understood all of that, not as an acting choice, but as autobiography. He had been maintaining emotional distance since he was a toddler in Navan. 3 more films followed: Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, Die Another Day, 4 films total, and over $2 billion worldwide, a franchise reinvented with an emotional depth it had not previously possessed. And then in 2004, Eon informed him that his services would no longer be required, and by some accounts he found out through the press. Not through a conversation, through a press release. He had not failed. He had simply been retired by the same machinery that had made him, and he said later, with the honesty of a man who has made peace with something that still occasionally aches, that he felt he had more to give, but it was not his decision to make. Then came the loss that undid everything the public thought it understood about the limits of a single person's capacity for grief. Charlotte Harris, the daughter Pierce had adopted and raised as entirely his own, had inherited her mother's warmth and her mother's disease. Diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the late 1990s, she fought while Pierce was still filming Bond, while he was still walking onto sets and playing the most invincible man in cinema, performing absolute control while privately living through something that no amount of fame or wealth provided the smallest protection against. Charlotte died on June 28, 2013, at 41 years old, the same disease, a different generation, the same man standing at a graveside trying to locate words for a loss that language was not designed to carry. Retreat was not what happened next. Pierce became one of the most visible advocates for ovarian cancer awareness and research funding anywhere in the world, donating, speaking at events, using the visibility that had sometimes felt like a burden as a vehicle for something that mattered more than any box office figure. He could not save Cassandra. He could not save Charlotte. What he could do was refuse to let their deaths remain only private, and in making them mean something beyond the boundary of his own grief, he found the only honest answer loss ever offers: not closure, not healing, but purpose. That same year Eon called in 1994, Pierce attended a party in Cabo San Lucas and encountered Keely Shea Smith, a journalist, television presenter, and environmental activist who was brilliant, outspoken, and entirely unimpressed by the particular brand of charm he had spent years perfecting for cameras. Hours passed in conversation about the ocean, about the environment, about things that matter when no camera is watching, and something in him recognized, not with dramatic certainty, but with something quieter and more reliable, that this person made sense to him. They married on August 4, 2001, in a castle in Ballintubber, Ireland, Pierce returning to the country that formed him. Two sons, Dylan and Paris, joined Charlotte, Christopher, and Sean, and the large love-filled family that the small boy in Navan had never dared to imagine for himself had become real. When tabloids commented on Keely's appearance with the specific cruelty that celebrity culture reserves for women who exist in public, Pierce responded not with diplomatic neutrality, but with complete directness, calling her beautiful, calling her his anchor, making clear that the opinions of people who had never sat across from her at breakfast were entirely irrelevant to him. The boy who spent his childhood never being chosen had become a man who chose fiercely and without apology. After Bond, The Matador in 2005 showed a loose, vulnerable, genuinely funny version of himself that startled critics who had assumed they already knew his range, earning him a Golden Globe nomination. Then Mamma Mia in 2008 confirmed it differently. He sang gamely, imperfectly, with a complete willingness to be ridiculous in service of joy, and the film earned over $600 million worldwide, making the man Hollywood had retired from its most invincible role one of the highest-grossing actors of that year. Through all of it, he painted. The practice that began in Navan as shelter had become a genuine artistic discipline, his work depicting the natural world and the human figure with a rawness that his performances occasionally approach but rarely exceed, exhibited internationally and raising funds for ovarian cancer research, connecting his art to the losses that shaped him in the most direct way available to him. The Tuxedo never told this story. It never told the story of the toddler left in Navan while his mother built a future she could only construct without him, or the teenager breathing fire in the London cold because it was the first time anyone had truly looked at him, or the young husband who sat beside his wife through 4 years of treatments and fear. It never told the story of the man who buried Cassandra and then buried Charlotte, who stood twice at graves marked by the same merciless disease and chose both times to transform the grief into something that helped people he would never meet. Bond always survives through gadgets and the convenient architecture of a screenplay. Pierce Brosnan survived through something that cannot be written into any script, through love, through loss, through the choice made again and again across a lifetime of reasons not to remain open to both, not the spy who saved the world, but the man who, against considerable odds, managed to save himself.